The lights were dim. The crowd was loud. Brooklyn in the late 80s did not wait for anyone. If you had something to say, you said it with your whole chest. And if you were a woman in hip-hop, you had to say it twice as strong. History remembers the loudest names. The platinum plaques. The rivalries. The headlines. But sometimes the voices that helped build the culture do not get called when the roll is read. What happens to the women who stood at the center of a movement, yet slowly faded from the conversation? Before hip-hop became a billion-dollar machine, before social media could rewrite a legacy overnight, there was a young female MC in hip-hop from Flatbush who believed her voice mattered. She stood beside the rise of Boogie Down Productions. She witnessed the early fire of KRS-One. She stepped into the studio for self-destruction when the culture needed healing. Her name was Miss Melody. And her story is not just about marriage, music, or loss. It is about loyalty, timing, and what it means to be present when history is being made. Do you remember her voice? Before the stages. Before the headlines. Before Boogie Down Productions became a name that echoed through New York. There was Ramona Scott. She was born on March 21, 1969, in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in the Flatbush section. Flatbush in the 70s and 80s was not polished. It was layered with Caribbean rhythms, block parties, basement speakers, and ambition that stretched far beyond the borough. For many young people, music was not a hobby. It was a doorway. There is not much public detail about her childhood. No long interviews about struggle. No dramatic origin myth. What we do know is this. She had a younger sister, Pamela, who later went by the rap name Harmony. Talent ran in the family. Harmony could rap. She could sing. But it was Ramona who found her identity early through rhythm. She once explained how the name Miss Melody came to life. At parties, she would rhyme casually. Her delivery was soft. Smooth. People thought she was singing. Her voice carried a calm tone, almost like a gentle hook layered over a beat. Someone described it as melodic. She took that word and made it hers. From a rhyme she had written, she added the Miss and introduced herself to the world as Miss Melody. That name would soon stand beside something much larger. At the time, KRS-One was not yet a legend. He was a young man living in a shelter in the Bronx. DJ Scott La Rock was his social worker. On weekends, Scott La Rock DJ'd in clubs and brought KRS-One along as the MC. One of those nights would change everything. That was where Miss Melody met KRS-One. They connected quickly. Not through fame. Not through money. Through belief. When KRS-One was homeless, Miss Melody and her family allowed him to move in with them. That detail matters. Before there was a movement. Before there were contracts. Before Boogie Down Productions reshaped hip-hop narratives about the South Bronx. There was a household that believed in a dream. She was present when the early foundation of Boogie Down Productions was forming. She watched as South Bronx ignited borough pride. She witnessed the tension between crews. She saw ambition turn into recording sessions. In many ways, Miss Melody was not just adjacent to history. She was inside the room while it was being written. And as a female MC in hip-hop, she was carving her own identity at the same time. She was not a background figure. She wrote her own rhymes. She developed her own style. She understood cadence, tone, and presence. By July 1987, she and KRS-One were married, becoming what many consider the first married couple in hip-hop. It was a union rooted in struggle and shared belief. But hip-hop was changing fast. And so was everything around them. The music was louder now. The crowds were bigger. The stakes were higher. Boogie Down Productions was no longer just a hungry collective from New York. It had become a force. South Bronx shifted the geography of hip-hop. Criminal Minded gave the streets a sharper voice. And at the center of that movement stood KRS-One, with Mississippi Melody close beside the rise. But success came with tension. The rivalry with the Juice Crew intensified. Words became weapons. Diss records traveled faster than peace offerings. Hip-hop was still young, and ego moved quickly. Miss Melody watched all of it unfold from within Boogie Down Productions. Not as a spectator, but as an artist building her own space. Then tragedy struck. Scott La Rock, the co-founder and guiding force behind Boogie Down Productions, was killed while attempting to mediate a conflict. His death shook the culture. Many would later call it the first major tragedy in hip-hop. The energy shifted overnight. The celebration of lyrical warfare suddenly felt real. Too real. After Scott La Rock's death, KRS-One stepped fully into leadership. Boogie Down Productions continued, but the tone deepened. Messages became sharper. Responsibility grew heavier. In 1988, Miss Melody released her first single, Hype, marking her official solo emergence. Soon after, she appeared with Boogie Down Productions in the film I'm Gonna Get You Sucka. Performing Jack of Spades. Her presence was confident. Her delivery was controlled. She was not trying to out-tout anyone. She commanded attention with clarity. Then came 1989. That year, the Stop the Violence movement formed in response to rising street violence and the death of a young fan at a Boogie Down Productions and Public Enemy show. The message was simple. The culture had to protect its own. From that movement came self-destruction. The record brought together some of the most powerful voices in hip-hop. It was not about charts. It was about survival. Self-destruction called out the cycle harming young black communities. It urged unity. It demanded accountability. Miss Melody's verse on self-destruction stood out. She delivered her lines with authority. Not rage. Not theatrics. Authority. As a female MC in hip-hop, her presence on self-destruction symbolized something larger. Women were not just observers of the culture's crisis. They were voices in its solution. That same year, she released her only full-length project, the Diva album. The Diva album showcased her range beyond collective projects. Tracks like Wake Up. Wake Up charted on Billboard's Hot Rap Singles, making it her only charting single. The Diva album did not chase trends. It reflected confidence, identity, self-definition. Yet even at her peak, the spotlight often tilted elsewhere. Boogie Down Productions was still primarily associated with KRS-One. The Stop the Violence movement was framed around leadership. Self-destruction became bigger than any individual contributor. But if you listen closely, her voice is there. Clear. Measured. Present. And it still echoes. Success does not always protect a marriage. Fame does not always protect a family. By the early 1990s, the energy around Boogie Down Productions had changed. The movement that once felt intimate had become institutional. Tours expanded. Industry pressures increased. The message of the Stop the Violence movement still echoed, but the personal lives behind the microphone were shifting. In 1992, Miss Melody and KRS-One divorced. There was no public spectacle. No dramatic press conference. No detailed explanation offered to fans. Just a quiet separation. For a couple once seen as the first married union in hip-hop, the ending felt understated. Almost private. After the divorce, Miss Melody gradually stepped away from the spotlight. There were no major follow-up albums after the Diva album. No aggressive media campaigns to reclaim visibility. The industry moved forward quickly. New voices emerged. A new era of female MC in hip-hop began to take shape, led by artists who would dominate the mid and late 90s. Meanwhile, the legacy of Boogie Down Productions continued to grow in academic discussions and cultural retrospectives. KRS-One remained a visible architect of conscious rap. The Stop the Violence movement and self-destruction were frequently cited as landmark cultural moments. But Miss Melody's name appeared less often. She had 2 sons. Details about her life during the late 90s and early 2000s remained largely private. There are no long interviews explaining her perspective on the industry. No memoir outlining what it felt like to stand inside Boogie Down Productions during its most intense years. Her absence created space for assumption but not for clarity. Sometimes, silence is not failure. It is choice. or circumstance. Then, on July 17, 2012, news spread quietly through the hip-hop community. Miss Melody had passed away from an unknown illness. Reports stated that she died in her sleep. She was only 43 years old. 43. The number felt small against the weight of history she had witnessed. Artists shared memories. D-Nice recalled speaking with her just a month before her passing, saying that the last thing she told him was that she was proud of him. It was a simple statement. But it revealed something about her character. Even away from the spotlight, she remained connected to the culture. The reaction was not explosive. It was reflective. Those who remembered self-destruction revisited her verse. Those who studied Boogie Down Productions revisited her role. Those who remembered the Diva album played it again with different ears. Her story did not end in scandal. It ended in stillness. And sometimes, stillness carries its own kind of power. Hip-hop in the late 80s was not just music. It was public dialogue. It was neighborhood journalism. It was cultural self-defense. Within that landscape, Miss Melody occupied a rare space. As a female MC in hip-hop during a male-dominated era, she stood inside Boogie Down Productions at a time when the genre was defining its moral direction. That alone matters. When Self-Destruction was released under the Stop the Violence movement, it was more than a collaborative record. It was a cultural intervention. Urban violence was rising. Young black lives were being lost. Community leaders were demanding accountability. Self-destruction became a call for internal reform. Not from politicians. From artists. MTV supported the record and gave it visibility. BET, concerned about its length, did not give it the same rotation. That contrast reflected a larger tension about how black messaging was distributed in mainstream media. Even within industry leadership, there were disagreements about who should participate and how the message should be framed. Yet the song endured. Today, when historians revisit self-destruction, they often focus on the collective power behind it. But Miss Melody's verse remains a critical reminder that women were central voices in that moral argument. The Stop the Violence movement was not only led by men. It was supported by women who understood that violence touched families, mothers, sisters, and communities. Compared to other high-profile female MC and hip-hop figures who built long commercial careers, Miss Melody's path appears shorter. But longevity is not the only measure of impact. Influence is also measured by timing, by presence, by contribution at critical moments. Boogie Down Productions helped define conscious rap. The Stop the Violence movement helped define responsibility within hip-hop. Self-destruction helped define unity during crisis. Miss Melody was there for all three. And when we examine American hip-hop history honestly, her name belongs in that conversation. Do we give enough space to the women who helped shape the message, even if they did not dominate the charts? That question still feels relevant. Some stories do not end with a farewell tour. Some legacies do not arrive wrapped in lifetime achievement awards. Miss Melody's legacy lives in moments. In studio sessions where Boogie Down Productions was still shaping its voice. In the resolve behind self-destruction when the Stop the Violence movement asked hip-hop to look inward. In the confidence of the Diva album, where she claimed space as a female MC in hip-hop on her own terms. She did not flood the market with albums. The Diva album remains her only full-length project. But that project stands as proof that Miss Melody was never simply standing beside KRS-One. She was writing, recording, contributing, defining her tone in a culture that was still deciding how to value women. Boogie Down Productions changed the vocabulary of rap. Self-destruction changed the conversation about responsibility. The Stop the Violence movement proved that hip-hop could organize itself around protection instead of profit. Miss Melody was present in those turning points. And presence matters. Today, when conversations about female MC in hip-hop highlight commercial success and streaming numbers, it is worth remembering the foundation years. The years when the culture was fragile. When Boogie Down Productions was fighting for borough identity. When self-destruction carried urgency instead of nostalgia. She was only 43 when she passed away. That number still feels unfinished. But influence is not measured only by years lived. It is measured by alignment with history. If you remember the first time you heard self-destruction, write, "I remember," in the comments. If you believe the Stop the Violence movement still has meaning today, comment yes. And if Miss Melody's story reminds you that some pioneers deserve a second look, share this with someone who grew up in that era. We talk often about legends. Sometimes, we need to talk about the voices who stood steady while legends were being built. Miss Melody was one of those voices.